Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shearer, and you're looking at another picture of the Columbia River. And the reason you're looking at another picture of the Columbia River is because it features once again in today's topic and today's story pretty heavily. So today we are speaking about the Astoria Expedition. And this is an unusual assignment today in that you need to get this information one of two ways. You can either attend the Google Meet, where I am going to tell this story again, or you can watch the rest of this Ed puzzle. But you only need to do one of those. So if you choose to watch this story on Ed puzzle, then you have fulfilled your assignment for today. If you'd rather hear the story live, you can come to the Google Meet, where I'll be telling this story again. But you don't need to do both. It's going to be the same story either way. So again, at the end of the Google Meet today, I will be taking attendance, and if you are still with me at the end of the meet, at the end of the story, I'm going to consider your assignment fulfilled for today, and you do not need to watch it again, the Ed puzzle, unless you really want to hear it twice. So let's jump in. Just as a quick reminder, we are going to talk about 6 early notable expeditions to Washington, the Pacific Northwest. So far, we've talked about Juan de Fuca, James Cook, Robert Gray, and the Astoria Expedition. Now you might notice that I'm skipping over George Vancouver and Lewis and Clark, and that's because the theme of the Columbia River is both prevalent in the Robert Gray story and the Astoria Expedition story. So today is the Astoria Expedition. One of my all-time favorite books is called Astoria by Peter Stark. And if you're ever looking for a book recommendation, I cannot recommend it enough. It is a great adventure story. So that's where I get most of the information and knowledge that I have about this. And I'm going to run you through a quick overview to start. So the very first overland trip to Washington, the Pacific Northwest, was Lewis and Clark in 1804. And that was the first time anyone had walked across the country. The Astoria Expedition, funded by John Jacob Astor, is the second trip across the country. And it comes 6 years after the Lewis and Clark one in 1810. And the difference is they were sending one group overland and one group by boat, and they were going to both meet up at the mouth of the Columbia, really close to where Lewis and Clark stayed. Now, this trip was successful in a few ways. It did successfully make it across the country, being the second trip to do so. And it does establish the first fort or outpost in the Pacific Northwest. However, it has a lot of failures. Of the 140 men who started the expedition, about 60 will die. The boat that they take and sail to the mouth of the Columbia, the Tonkin, ends up exploding. Nobody really remembers this expedition, and it's not a well-known story. And then the ending is really kind of anticlimactic. It just kind of ends. So not a very known story, but a lot of weird parts to it. Now this is Lewis and Clark, and you might be asking yourself, why do I even tell this Astoria story at all? And it's because of Lewis and Clark that I tell this story. On the Lewis and Clark expedition, which we'll talk about next week, everything goes right. And that's hard to really understand just how well everything goes on the Lewis and Clark expedition until you hear about the expedition, this one, where everything goes wrong. So I like telling the Astoria story because it's just an example of what could have happened, but doesn't on the Lewis and Clark story. We're going to begin with the man who funded the expedition and who it's named after, John Jacob Astor. So Astoria is named after John Jacob Astor. And that's him. And he is a German immigrant who came to the United States with nothing. As a young man, he worked in a tanning and hide shop. So that's where you would take fresh pelts that fur trappers would catch, and you would turn them into hats, jackets, etc. He saved his money, and he was eventually able to start his own company, the Pacific Fur Trading Company, who will go on to be a pretty big company. So he works his way up, gets his own company, and he begins making a lot of money, mostly in the Great Lakes region. And then he has the idea that if he can expand to the Pacific Northwest, he's going to untap a huge market of furs. Of course, we talked about otter and beaver pelts, etc., and that is his motivation for coming out west. Now, this man will go on to become the richest man in America at the time of his death, with a fortune of over $20 million, which in today's money would be about $500 million. The Astoria Expedition actually is one of the reasons he quits the fur trading business, but he does buy a bunch of land in New York, and he foresees that New York City will become a way bigger city, and he buys up most of the island of Manhattan, and that's where he makes most of his money. He gets so wealthy, and he passes on such a fortune that by the time his great-grandson, John Astor IV, dies on the Titanic, the family fortune is about $2.2 billion. So if you didn't catch that, this is Manhattan. This is where Wall Street is, and a lot of people think of it as the heart of the financial district of America. He bought this with his fur trading money from his business, and he bought other parts of New York, including, I believe, Times Square. So John Jacob Astor makes most of his money in real estate. And he gets so wealthy that his son, or his great-grandson, John Jacob Astor IV, is unfortunately the richest man to die on the Titanic. So the idea of his expedition is that one group is going to go overland, and one group is going to take a boat all the way around South America and meet the overland party in modern-day Astoria on the mouth of the Columbia and set up a fort. The overland party is led by William Price Hunt, and the maritime party is led by Captain Jonathan Thorne, and I want you to take a look at that man, Jonathan Thorne, because he is going to go on to become really the bad guy of this story. So if the story has a villain, it's this man, Jonathan Thorne. We're going to start with William Price Hunt and the overland trip. So just a little background on William Price Hunt. He has some experience as a fur trapper, but he has no experience in what they call the interior of the country. That's kind of the unexplored wilderness of the West. He hasn't been out west much. He is seen as very loyal to John Jacob Astor, and history might not view him super greatly, if that's a term, but he is a solid leader, if not exceptional, like Lewis and Clark. He does his best. He makes a lot of mistakes. This is the route that Lewis and Clark take in 1804, and this is what they want to follow. So I want to point a couple things out. Quick version of the Lewis and Clark route. They start in St. Louis. They go up the Missouri River at the Mandan Village. That's where they pick up Sacagawea. They continue on the Missouri River until they have to cross the Cascade Mountains, at which point they drop down through the Bitterroot Mountains of Idaho, and they get on the Columbia River, where they sail out to sea, or out to the ocean. This is what William Hunt wanted to do. But what he does is he also starts in St. Louis, leaves October 21st of 1810. He does go up to the Mandan Village, but he is convinced by other fur trappers not to continue on the same route that Lewis and Clark do, because they're worried about Blackfeet Indians. And the Blackfeet Native American tribe still has a big reservation in Montana, so in this area here. But on the way back on the Lewis and Clark, remember that's the expedition before this, on the way back, Meriwether Lewis actually shot and killed a Blackfoot brave, and the Blackfeet are no longer receptive to white people traveling through their area. That's at least what William Hunt is told, so he decides to drop down into Wyoming, continue to Idaho, and he's going to take a more southern route. So again, if you look at the Lewis and Clark route, they go above Wyoming, they go through Montana, and midway through the trip, Hunt decides to go down a different route. Now, one kind of unique, cool parallel to the Astoria Expedition is they also have a Native American woman who is pregnant traveling with them, just like Sacagawea did with Lewis and Clark, Marie Dorian, who's from the Iowan tribe, and she is traveling with them. She's also pregnant, just like Sacagawea. One difference between her and Sacagawea is that she has two small children with her, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. So this is also just insanely impressive. To walk across the country while pregnant with 2 toddlers is insane. Unfortunately, she does. The baby does not survive the trip, and her husband dies. She's married to a French fur trapper as well, just like Sacagawea was. But I just wanted to give a quick mention to Marie Dorion, who kind of is lost in history, but has a very similar experience in a certain sense to Sacagawea. Now, when they go through Wyoming, which again is here, they do have some successes in that they discover, as far as European or Americans are concerned, the Grand Tetons, and they name them. This is now a famous national park in Wyoming. So this is the first expedition to both go through and name the Grand Tetons in Wyoming. Now, when they get to Idaho, things get a little weird. You can see this yellow line here is the Snake River, and the purple line is the Columbia River. So the Snake actually flows into the Columbia. And they get on the Snake River believing that they're on the Columbia River. Now, if you remember, Lewis and Clark actually finished their journey on the Columbia River. So they think they're on the same river that Lewis and Clark traveled. However, Lewis and Clark do not report any major waterfalls, whereas it turns out the Snake River has some major waterfalls and some deep canyons where you can't really get out of the boat and you can't stop. So that leads to a little bit of a catastrophe when they come across what is now known as Twin Falls, Idaho. And one of their crew dies very sadly when he's not able to get out of their boat. They were in this canyon here. Everything seemed smooth. They thought they were on the Columbia, and you can imagine their sadness and surprise when they lost a bunch of their gear and one of their crew members who's not able to get out of his boat in time and crashes over the falls. They also discover what is now known, and they also name what is now known as Hell's Canyon, which is in the southeast corner of Washington and northwest corner of Idaho. But they name it Hell's Canyon because you can't get out. Once you're in, you're kind of committed. They tried to explore it, but really it's just too deep, too long. And they end up making kind of a fateful decision to split up into smaller parties. So they're in Idaho here, where it says Lewiston, and they end up splitting up into smaller parties. Now, some of the parties get lost and are never found again. Some of the parties get, a couple of them wander back into the Hell's Canyon area and disappear, presumably also dying down there. And William Hunt, the leader, and a few others end up hiking through northern Oregon. And I want you to notice on this map right where it says John Day, because you can imagine their surprise, William Hunt and the group that he's with, when they run into a white man in the woods, completely lost and scared, and they run into a man named John Day. And John Day is a young man, he's a fur trapper from South Dakota, whose family was attacked, I think by Blackfeet Indians, in retaliation for what Lewis and Clark did, and trying to protect their land. And John Day ends up fleeing this kind of attack, and he gets lost. And he's been lost for over a year. And he's wandered across the country into the Oregon wilderness, and by many accounts, he's kind of insane by the time he comes across a European expedition party of other white people. And you can imagine everyone's surprise to run into this guy. And he makes very little sense. He babbles, he's gone crazy, he's paranoid, and you might be that way too, had you been living in the dark, scary Oregon forest for weeks trying to survive. So one part of the book and the story I really like is it does talk a lot about just the psychology of the deep, dark woods of the Pacific Northwest and what that would be like where this is everywhere. The shadows mess with you at night, the sounds at night, the animals. It's enough to really mess with your psyche to the point that you kind of lose a big sense of yourself. And that's what happened to John Day. And unfortunately, John Day does not survive Well, in some accounts, nobody really knows what happens to him, but in the account in the book, he does not survive the expedition. He is so crazy. He does make it to Astoria and to the coast, but eventually he's killed by a Chinook Indian who takes pity on him and basically thinks mercy killing him is the best thing possible. But strangely enough, there's all these things named after him. So there's actually a John Day River and a John Day City, which is a picture of that you're looking at here. There's a John Day Creek, John Day Fossil Bay National Monument, and there's a John Day Dam on the Columbia River. There's a ton of stuff named after John Day. All right, so the Hunt Expedition, it's a fast version, but they do eventually make it to modern-day Astoria. They go to set up their fort, but they really can't set it all the way up until they get the rest of the supplies from the Tonkin and from Captain Jonathan Thorne. So meanwhile, Jonathan Thorne and the Tonkin, the boat. A little bit about Jonathan Thorne. He is a British naval officer. He is very much into order and respect. He is the youngest officer to reach his rank of lieutenant of a naval shipyard by the age of 27. His journals indicate that he might have been of poor mental health, and even though he very outwardly puts out confidence, his journals indicate that maybe he was very insecure. He doesn't trust others, he suspects people, and he is very rigid in his rules and his command, and he rules with an iron fist over his crew and his boats. So he is actually recruited by Astor. He's released from the military in order to take a private boat, John Jacob Astor's boat, the Tonkin, and to sail with a crew out to the Pacific Northwest. And one thing you need to know is his crew is not sailors. They are French fur trappers. And as you might be able to guess, French fur trappers are not necessarily great sailors. They're also not necessarily great roommates in the sense that they smoke, they drink, they swear, they are not disciplined. These are people who love their freedom and the great outdoors, and they do not want to be told what to do by a young boat captain. And from day one, it is tension. So early on the trip, Jonathan Thorne tries to do an 8 p.m. curfew, telling the French that they have to go to bed and that they're not allowed to smoke on the boat and that they're not allowed to swear. They laugh him off, and it is constant fighting between him and the French. On a regular boat, it is not uncommon to flog or whip crewmen who do not follow orders. Jonathan Thorne tries this both with his own crew and with the French, and you can imagine the tensions that build and the hatred of the French for their captain by the time they get to the Pacific Northwest. They are continually at odds, and there's continual discontentment between the parties. Now, remember, they have to go from New York, which is here, where my cursor is, all the way around South America, around Cape Horn, all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. And to top it all off, not only is there tension, but they hit bad weather. And so they stop in the fairly newly discovered Hawaiian Islands, and they relax for a bit. It does not ease tensions, but they wait for the weather to pass, which means that this party over here in Washington, the Astoria, the rest of the expedition has to wait a long time for them. And while they're in Hawaii, I want to point out that they do something that's pretty common and pretty, honestly, just disgusting. They just take Hawaiian men. They take, I believe it was 3 sailors. They take Hawaiian natives, and they just enlist them as sailors, which is a fairly common thing for these European and American boats in the 1700s. They would just go to Pacific Islands and take people. And the belief was that they're good swimmers and good rowers. But it's just a very upsetting thing. So they do take some Hawaiian men, and they make their way to the mouth of the Columbia and to Astoria. So here is Astoria. You can see it here. And this is the mouth of the Columbia River. Now, we talked about this in a previous lesson, so I'm going to just do a quick reminder. This is a very dangerous place in terms of the Pacific Ocean. You have all this water coming off the Columbia, which makes for all kinds of wave systems. You also have all this sand that gets brought down, making all kinds of sand dunes and underwater hazards. Again, they call it the graveyard of the Pacific. It's big waves. lots of shipwrecks, and lots of just carnage on the water. So it's under that backdrop that I tell you the next story that really tells you about Jonathan Thorne. So Captain Jonathan Thorne gets to the mouth of the Columbia, and I should note, it's a dark, stormy, high winds, high rains, big waves kind of night. And he gets to the mouth of the Columbia, and it's nighttime, and he turns to his first mate. This is the second in command on the boat, a guy by the last name Fox. And he tells Fox that he wants him to take a small rowboat into these huge waves and row up the Columbia to find a route into the river. And Fox is like, "Are you crazy?" And he actually taunts Fox. He says he should have stayed back in Boston. You know, he calls him Scaredy Cat, the equivalent of Scaredy Cat. And he tells Fox, "You're going to follow orders, or I'm going to basically flog you and shoot you and kill you myself. You're going to do this." And Fox can't figure out why he's sending him off to what is certainly to be his death. And it comes to light that the captain is mad at Fox, his right-hand man, and somebody who he sailed with for, I believe, over 5 years. He's mad at him because he feels like he's been too nice to the French fur trappers. So Fox begs him to at least give him some rowers, and he gives him a cook and another man who have very little rowing experience. Fox is given enough time to write a letter to his wife and children. He gives his personal belongings to one of the other sailors. He says his hugs, he gives goodbyes, and he is put into a small rowboat in the middle of a storm, in the middle of huge waves, and it's not but 2-3 minutes before the rowboat capsizes and he is lost, along with the other 2 rowers. Fox is basically sacrificed and killed for no reason. Well, they then wait a couple days, and they wait for nicer weather and daytime. And then he puts 5 more men into a small rowboat, and he gives them a device. There's a device they bring. It's like a weighted ball with a line at the end. And those 5 men row out, and their job is to find a way through the underwater sandbars and to find a way that's deep enough for the big Tonkin boat to go up the Columbia. And they do that. It takes some hours, but they're successful, and they find a way through. However, you would think that once they found a way through, the next step would be for Captain Thorne to pick up these 5 men, but he just doesn't. He takes the Tonkin and he sails right by the little rowboat. And the men are screaming. They're like, "Wait, stop." And they're frantically trying to row after the Tonkin. And the men on the Tonkin are yelling at the captain, "Stop, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm my captain. I'm the captain. I'm going to do what I want." And they ask him, they're like, "What? They'll die out there." And he says, "Well, they have fulfilled their duty, and it is their honor to die for their country." And he just leaves these 5 guys in this rowboat who found the way through, and they continually roll after him until eventually they're capsized by a big wave, and all but one of them die. And the one who doesn't die, by the way, his name, I believe, is James Lewis. But the one who doesn't die will feature later in the story, but just a horrible waste of human life for absolutely no reason, and that's Captain Jonathan Thorne. So he gets to the fort, and Thorne drops off the supplies. He's lost 8 men getting into the Columbia River. He drops off his supplies. He reinforces William Hunt's overland expedition, and then Thorne continues on with about half the crew. And he takes the crew onto the second part of their journey. So the Columbia River's down here, and they go up to Vancouver Island here. And the second part of his journey, he's got an ulterior direction from John Jacob Astor that he needs to be trading with Coast Salish natives for otter pelts. So he sails up to Vancouver Island to meet with Coast Salish Native Americans for otter pelts. And they meet with a chief. And a chief comes in with a bunch of his braves and his warriors, and they meet on the boat, on the Tonkin. And the kind of the ceremony is the chief lays down a pile of otter pelts that he's willing to trade. And in exchange, Captain Thorne lays down whatever he's willing to trade, which I believe was gunpowder and weapons. And so Captain Thorne lays down his stuff, and the chief lays down otter pelts. And Captain Thorne says, "I'm going to need more otter pelts." So the chief puts a few more otter pelts on the pile, but finally Captain Thorne says it's not enough, and he keeps insulting the chief, telling him that he needs all of his otter pelts. And it just tensions rise to the point Where as the story goes, Captain Thorne picks up an otter pelt and he smacks the chief in the face with the otter pelt. And his whole crew sighs because they're like, this man is going to get us killed. The chief leaves, and sure enough, later that night, with over 200 Native American braves, they do come back, the natives do, and they storm the Tonkin. Thorne dies pretty quickly in the battle that ensues, as do almost all of the sailors on the ship and many, many Native Americans. And the battle is pretty quick. Pretty quickly, the sailors are overrun, but James Lewis, the guy who survived the little rowboat, made his way back to the group. Him and another man eventually make it into the cargo hold of the Tonkin, which is full of gunpowder, and they are able to light the gunpowder. Rather than be killed by the Indians, they blow up the entire boat, killing at least 70 Coast Salish with them. And the whole expedition ends in a giant explosion. All in all, nobody knows for sure, but maybe up to 200 Native Americans died in this endeavor, mostly from the explosion. And that's really the end of the story, because back at the fort, where the rest of the crew is, things just kind of peter out and end. There's a war with Britain called the War of 1812, and the fort gets turned over to the British. Most of the people, like William Hunt, are dismissed to go back home, and they make their way back home or to other trading forts, and it just kind of ends. There's no big party at the end, like with Lewis and Clark. There's no parades. There's no newspaper articles. It just kind of peters out and ends. John Jacob Astor considers this to be such a debacle of a trip that he eventually gets out of the fur trading business and just makes all of his money by buying real estate in New York. So, last thing I'll leave you with is there is now in Oregon, they've turned this whole story into a stage production just recently, in the last couple years, and there's a very good chance that this story at some point will gain momentum, because it is a crazy story. And I left out a ton of details, even though this is long. And eventually I could see this being, it seems like it needs to be a movie. So 7th graders, again, if you've made it this far, you have now completed your assignment. And I appreciate you guys listening. Have a great rest of your day.